wrote about a flight of passenger pigeons. That flew over Toronto in 1876 when he was 16 years old. And in fact, it was the last great flock of passenger pigeons that flew over the city of Toronto. He describes it here as this, like a trail of smoke across from horizon to horizon that went on intermittently all day. And there was hundreds of thousands, if not millions of birds that flew over during that time, right? By passenger pigeon standards, it's actually pretty tame, because at times before that, their flocks would have blocked out the sun, darkened the sky. And again, passed over for hours like that. There were 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons at one time in North America. 24 years later, the last passenger pigeon seen in Toronto was actually 5 birds seen flying over Toronto Island. So, and by 1914, so that was 1900, by 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo. It's this like incredible story of collapse of a species. But interestingly, the trees in Crowther's Woods and in parts of E.T. Seton Park were around when that flock flew over. Like Aldo Leopold once wrote that trees live today who in their youth were shaken by a living wind. And you can still see those trees. So this is a white oak on the left here, on the left here, which is probably was about 30 years old when, so it's around 180 years old. It would have been around 30 years old when that last flock flew through. Okay. Here's a red oak in Sunnybrook Park. And again, old enough that it would have seen the passenger pigeons. And it's humbling to stand next to these trees and realize that the amount of change, the kind of huge change we've wrought on the landscape in really a couple of human lifetimes, or a couple of Toronto Field Naturalist lifetimes, I suppose, too. Or half the lifetime of a single tree, less than half the lifetime of a single tree. So these trees that were shaken by a living wind that you can now stand next to, they'll be there when my kids get old and maybe their kids get old. These trees carry this huge record of history. A little more history that I thought you guys might be interested in, because one of the people who was very inspired by E.T. Seton was Charles Soriol, who was really a great conservationist. He fought for the Don Valley. He wrote about the Don Valley. He ended up working in conservation as a sort of second career. It started as a passion project, and he ended up being the first director of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. He lived in the valley, and that's how all of that kind of came about. He had a cottage that he would live in seasonally in the valley, and almost all traces of that cottage were erased during the construction of the Don Valley Parkway. And these 2 railway ties buried in the ground are actually all that's left to mark his time in the valley. And they held up a suspension bridge that he had built across the East Don River. And you can still find these along the east shore of the East Don River above Taylor Massey Creek. If you stumble around, they're not marked. And it's kind of special to find them because they're so hard to find. And I imagine that Charles Soriol or E.T. Seton, who spent so much time tromping around in the valley, this is what they would have been looking for, something. So it kind of harkens right back to how they spent their time in the valley. I kind of hope they never mark it in a way. Anyway, Charles Soriol, I would say, because he did so much work on conservation, he was probably laid some of the early foundations of what is now the modern greenbelt. He is really a very important conservation figure. And so I thought we would go a little bit out of the city into the GTA, into the greenbelt for a minute. This is in Pickering. This is the Seton Trail. It runs along West Duffins Creek in Pickering. They did a really nice job on this staircase, I think, because they actually wound it around the trees rather than cutting trees down to make a straight line. And it's quite actually a lovely staircase. It winds down through a 135-year-old roughly hemlock forest, and which is an interesting number because it puts us right at the boundary of what we consider old growth forest. Usually we would consider old growth forest, well, old growth forest has as many definitions as there are people almost to talk about the definition of old growth forest. But usually we would say if you're being kind of lenient, kind of generous, you would say old growth forest starts when the growth of trees starts to slow down, which actually depends a lot by the species. But usually we throw out a number of 140. That's a kind of a common number. It actually makes a lot of sense in some ways because at that point the forest starts to change because like if a tree falls down, it doesn't get filled in as quickly, and so there's a gap. There's more gaps in the forest. There's more large logs. Like things change in the forest. It's also kind of a commercial definition because at that point they like to have harvested, so there's not that much forest of that age as well. So it makes sense in a lot of ways as the beginning of old growth. And of course, the forests continue to evolve past that, developing more old growthness, if you like, which I think is a totally made up term, but actually it might not be. Anyway, they become more old growthy. So this is 135 years old. So when my kids finish high school, it will be old growth. And then it will continue to evolve for hundreds of years. So that's kind of how the definitions work as a starting point, and then you can use definitions for different stages of old growth. Sort of like saying a person is an adult, right? It doesn't end there. But as you walk up the Seton Trail, so that lovely staircase was below Taunton Road. If you keep going up the trail, then you get to some more like old growth. These trees, I know, reach at least 180 because you can count the rings. I mean, this is a kind of a trick always, is if you're in a forest and you see a log, you can just count the rings and you'll know how old that tree was. Some trees are easier to count than others. So at least 180-year-old forest as you go up the Seton Trail across from the Whitevale Golf Course if you're going up there. The tree, they show their signs of age in various ways. So the tree on the left, I would say is actually probably, I would guess, fair amount older, well into the 200s at least, I would think. Because it's got this, what we call a celery stalk growth form. It's incredibly fat trunk and all twisty too. And then all these big branches clustered at the top. Imagine it as a celery stalk. That's a great sign for old growth. And in the middle, you got this kind of corded base. And then on the right, the tree is balding, so it's a sugar maple that's the bark is starting to shed at the base. That's also a great sign for old age. Now I wanted to talk about the Seton Trail partly because it has become, to me, and I think to a lot of people, it would be a symbol of resilience of the Greenbelt. Because what was mostly at stake in the Greenbelt removal was the Duffins Rouge Agricultural Preserve, which is everything between the Seton Trail and Rouge Park. If you look at this map, you can see that it's a huge triangle. And that's what was saved. On the right, you can see a picture from the Seton Trail, and everything behind that trail sign was owned by developers. And that's the case at several points along the trail that would have just been houses right up to the trail. So apart from, and the West Duffins Creek that the trail runs along is one of the cleanest creeks in the entire in the GTA, one of the cleaner creeks running into Lake Ontario, but one of the cleanest creeks in the GTA, because there's been so little development around it. So there was a lot at stake, including all the Class 1 farmland. So that's a bit of a celebration story there. Okay, I'm going to jump back into Toronto a little bit. This is an oak savanna that is at Lambton Park. It's kind of an obscure park out by the Humber River. It's right beside Lambton Arena. So most people just go there to go to the arena. The trees here also reach at least 200 years old. And these are like native prairie grasses that grow under them. And they've started doing occasional prescribed burns to bring them back. Uh-oh. Oh, okay. What's remarkable about Lambton Park is not just that it's actually quite a beautiful old growth oak savanna. It's fairly central, like it's in Bloor West Village out by the Humber. It's a nice part of Toronto, pretty central, really. But it also has red pine. It's an old growth oak pine savanna. Now, red pine is not, and this is natural red pine. These are 200-year-old red pines. These were not planted. Red pine we usually think of in plantations in southern Ontario, because red pine's natural habitat is usually places like Temagami. This is Temagami. You see the tree on the right actually has 2 fire scars. It survived at least 2 fires. Their bark, they have this puzzle piece bark that resists fires. They resist the cambium and they get killed by fire. So that's where we usually find red pine, is places like Temagami, or this is in the Spanish forest. So it's quite shocking to find it in Toronto, actually. There was actually historically some, and I think there may still be 1 or 2 trees in Hyde Park as well. So yeah, this is near the Spanish River up past Sudbury. And this Tom Lee, who's standing in this picture, had trouble believing me. He doubted me when I told him there was natural red pine in Lambton Park, because it's so surprising, until he came and saw it. And then it's undeniable, and you can count, we counted the rings on a dead red pine in there and got over 200 years. So it's pretty amazing. But it makes sense if you think about the fact that it's such a fire-dependent species, and these savannas would have been renewed by fire. Right? So the other trees in this savanna forest are mostly black oak trees. And black oak is not quite as fire resistant. It's more likely, especially when it's young, to be killed by a fire, but it readily resprouts if it is killed. And once it gets old enough, then the bark does resist the fires. So it's also a fire-dependent species. So this is pretty amazing forest that's, to me, like a kind of ecologically amazing, and it's right here in Toronto. And in the neighborhoods around it, there's also large oak trees in the neighborhoods. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a sec. But one thing I often think when I'm there, and this is not a new thought, but it's particularly appropriate here, I think, because there's all these big oak trees scattered through the neighborhoods. What if everyone just planted prairie grasses and wildflowers in their yards? Then it would be houses plopped into an oak savanna, you know? Like, it's kind of, yeah, I mean, maybe that could happen. I believe that we could do that at some point, you know? People would be open to it. So there's a thought. Now, why are those trees, why are there so many big oaks along the neighborhoods right beside Lambton Park? Well, some of them are there because they once lined the carrying place. Do you guys know the Toronto carrying place? So it's this storied trail. It was a trail that led from Lake Ontario up to the Holland River and then into Lake Simcoe, and from there you could get into Georgian Bay. So it was a very important travel route, and it was kind of one of the easiest ways. It was still a 45-kilometer portage. In fact, we call it a portage, but in fact nobody even carried canoes. The indigenous people would build a new canoe at the end, which apparently took them 2 days. So the only person, I think it was La Vérendrye. There was a French explorer who carried his canoes, and it took him 3 weeks, I think. So anyway, so along the Carrying Place Trail, they left shade trees historically. And so some of those shade trees of the Carrying Place Trail are the trees that are in these neighborhoods. And we have a pretty good idea in places in Bloor West Village where the trail ran. And so you can be walking under these trees that may have one time shaded the Carrying Place Trail. And by the way, the Carrying Place Trail is why Toronto is named Toronto, because Lake Simcoe was actually Lake Toronto. And it was called the Toronto Carrying Place Trail because it went to Lake Toronto. And then, and it was an important route that was marked on maps, and the French built a Fort Toronto on Lake Ontario. And that's kind of how the name migrated from the north down to the trail, and then down to the fort, and finally became the name of the city. The name also refers to these fish weirs, actually, which are in Lake Simcoe, in the narrows between the Simcoe and the chain. And those were actually a series of pole weirs that would channel the fish. It was this incredibly productive fishery. And they've actually aged those poles that are stuck into the bottom of the lake at over 5,000 years old. So put that in context, this trail is probably also thousands of years old. Truly like historic trail. So it makes these trees seem pretty young. They're just little babies. But there are trees in Ontario that don't seem like little babies, even on that time scale. And those are the ancient cedars. So now we're moving out. So this is Lion's Head Nature Reserve. It's up on the Bruce Peninsula. The tree on the left is 1,300 years old, over 1,300 years old. It started growing in the year 701. You can see it's actually prying that rock away from the cliff over more than 1,000 years. Nearby, 3 of these 4 trees, so this is at the base of the cliff on that rocky talus slope. 3 of these 4 trees are over 1,000 years old. The tree on the right is 1,145 years old, the oldest of the 3. And then there's a tree just behind it that's not quite as old. I think it's somewhere 800 or something. These are often called the 3 kings. And the reason that they lived that long is partly because they're growing on this rock and fire can't kill them. Like, isolation is your friend if you're trying to live for a long time as a tree. Here's another tree. This one is mere 850 years old or so. This is on Flower Pot Island. You can actually get quite close to this one though. And it appears to be dead. It is in fact only mostly dead. And as Miracle Max would tell you, there's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead. Because mostly dead is still slightly alive. And which part is alive on this tree? There's the one branch hanging down. Now, this whole business of being mostly dead is actually pretty important to the longevity of cedars. So the rest of the tree, by the way, died around 1850. So when part of a tree dies, usually, like let's say 3/4 of most trees die, that tree would just die. The difference with cedars is they have sectors of their root system that feed directly one sector of their crown. That's very unusual. And that is how they kind of become virtually immortal like this. And so, yeah, if part of a cedar tree dies, part of the root system dies, well, part of the crown dies, it's fine. The rest keeps growing. It results in some interesting growth forms, though, that will help you identify ancient cedars. So in this case, the only part of the trunk that was alive was on the bottom. There's a bit of living bark there, and so it grew as a strip instead of circular. So that kind of strip growth is a really great indicator of old age in cedars. So that tree yeah, might have been growing like that for certainly decades, quite possibly centuries. Here's a cross section, a 300-year-old tree, and I can hold the cross section in my hand. The last 100 years of growth on that tree are that little squiggly bit at the bottom, and the last 50 years are the little white bit of sapwood. That tree, so yeah, again, you can see how this strip growth can keep the tree alive for a very long time. That tree was actually in Temagami. And that's another interesting thing about ancient cedars is we actually don't know where most of them are. Like we've inventoried the Niagara Escarpment, but this is in Temagami. No one's really looked twice at these cedars, which are probably hundreds of years old. So if you go on a canoe trip in an area with a lot of rock, you can keep your eyes open for all these kind of signs that these trees are old. And basically, if they look bizarre, they're probably old, hundreds of years old. The other interesting thing about ancient cedars to me is that there are trees nearly 1,000 years old that are in Milton, and this incredibly populated part of Canada. And we've been living next to them for hundreds of years, well, thousands of years, right? From a European perspective, hundreds of years. And only in 1989 did we actually realize that they were in that kind of, that they were ancient. They were practically 1,000 years old. And then went up further up the escarpment and found those trees on lines had a number of them over 1,000 years old. So that's a big thing to miss for that long. And it makes you wonder, what else are we missing? Probably a lot of things, right? One of the things we were missing until very recently was this black gum, which is the oldest hardwood tree in Canada, 580 years old. It's near Niagara Falls, and that's Nate Tornvleet is standing next to it, and he found it, I believe it was in 2018. And he actually found it by looking, this is a 1934 aerial photo. You can just pull these up on Google. And he just pulled them up and he looked and he said, well, where was their forest in 1934? That's a good place to look for old trees. And he was specifically interested in black gum because we know that they can live long. We actually hadn't found them to that kind of age in Ontario, but he was like, I'm interested in finding old black gums. So you can see those kind of squiggly lines on those are actually swamp formations, which is where you tend to find black gum. So where there was those sort of slough swamp formations next to an existing forest, that's where he went out. And here's a few more pictures showing that 580-year-old tree. By the way, he found a number of trees in the sort of 400 plus range down right near Niagara Falls, in the Niagara Falls city limits, I believe, actually. He wasn't just going out and coring trees randomly, though. He was actually looking for, I've kind of started alluding to this, these features of old growth. Like what tells you a tree is old? So in this case, you can really see what I was talking about. I was talking about the bark balding on sugar maple. Well, look at the tree, on the base of this tree on the right, and then actually even halfway up the trunk. Black gums actually get thicker and thicker bark. These huge ridges develop for a few hundred years, and then they start falling off. So if you see a black gum that has a lot of balding, it's probably more than 300 years old. So that's a great sign. That's the kind of thing he was looking for. But also, see how twisty, it's called trunk sinuosity because it's kind of snake-like. See how twisty that trunk is? That is a classic sign of old age in trees. And we don't really know why. It may be because the tree was shaded and it was looking for the sun. It may be because the terminal leader was killed and it sent out a new kind of off to the side, started a new. We don't really know why. It may even be in some cases, but that's not the main reason, that they left this deciduous trees because they weren't commercially valuable. But that's not the main reason. We know that because you find this in all different places across species. It's an indicator of age. So Nate told me about that tree, and we started talking, and then I invited him up to some work I'm doing in Algonquin, which I've been doing for a while now. I got interested in Algonquin because when I was writing the first edition of the Old Growth Forest book, I realized there wasn't very good information on the old growth there. So I actually cored a few trees at that time, and I started to realize that there was unprotected old growth in Algonquin. And I kind of revisited that in 2018 and brought Nate out with me. And you can see actually he's coring a tree. So that's a hemlock tree there. And if you look at the top of that tree, it looks a little bit like a hardwood tree, like it goes up and then it branches out flat. That's pretty unusual for hemlock. That is a great sign of old age in hemlock. We didn't get a solid core from that tree because it was hollow, but a tree nearby was over 400 years old. So then last year, we actually went back and we started doing real volunteer surveys in there. And in those surveys, we would collect all this different information about the stand. So we used forestry methods. So we would hold up a prism, which it tells you, basically it's some weird math where you say trees are in or out, and you can calculate the volume of the trees. And if you go and then take a diameter of those trees, it tells you a lot about the stand in a very short amount of time. And we also measured logs using some fancy math techniques that was very fast, where you would just basically measure a log every time it crossed a line, rather than doing a big plot. Importantly, we looked for stumps. So on the bottom here, these stumps last a long time. So you can tell if the forest has been logged. Like white pine stumps are the most common in Algonquin, and they show up kind of all over because they really wanted the white pine back in the 1800s, especially. And white pine stumps last over 100 years. So you can, like that stump on the left there is probably 80 to 100 years old. It's still in good shape. On the right is a hardwood stump. That's a little trickier. They rot a lot faster, but you can see these kind of black masses for quite a while as well. And as you can actually, so that's a tree core at the bottom there. So that's how we aged the trees, right? You count the rings on the tree cores. And we certainly found more old trees. This tree on the left is 413 years old. The tree that Nate is coring in the middle, and also you can see it on the right with the fork, 425 years old. And look, it's not a big tree, right? So again, you're looking for these characteristics. What tells you? So, I mean, they really hold their diameter like a big column. They have these big branches. They have character, kind of like the ancient cedars. Here's the oldest tree we found, 427. It was actually in one of our plots. And again, not obvious. Like we might not have even called that one of the oldest trees, but it was. But it's got, again, that sinuosity. It's got that like jog near the top of the tree. It's got big branching, some big branching, oldest diameter. Just out of interest, I thought I'd put this in. If you plot age versus size in the hemlock trees, when we go out and look for these characteristics and then core trees, Excel thinks that the larger a tree is, the younger it gets. That's where the way it drew the line. Because a lot of our oldest trees were in the 40 centimeters, so they were like about this big around, not huge. Of course, that was when we go and specifically core old looking trees, but even on a much larger data set, it gets interesting. So it's a weird, because it's radius in millimeters, but you could basically say like the bottom is 20 centimeters diameter and then 40 centimeters diameter as you go up. You just double it by 10. But so you start to see that there is a pattern in this huge hemlock data set from the literature where they do get older as they get bigger, but it's so scattered that it's really hard to draw any kind of conclusion, right? Because a 60 centimeter, a big hemlock can be 80, 90 years old. A 20 centimeter hemlock can be around 300. Okay, so this is the problem with relying on size. This is why we have to look for these other characteristics. And this is what it looked like when I laid it out. We went and did these transects, and we cored mostly in the plots, or we did a lot of cores in the plots, so we'd have like a standardized data set. So we're not just like coring the old trees that we see, right? It's pretty easy to criticize that. And even then, the youngest tree we got in one of our plots was 160 years old, right? So this is a very old forest, it turned out. We've got 6 trees over 400 in this one area. And they're in several different places, right? So, and there's a kind of cluster at the top where we cored a lot of trees because we were excited. And then down in the kind of lower middle, there's another 400-year-old tree. And then at the very bottom, that was the very first area we went into. So they're widely scattered through this forest. And it's a beautiful forest. It's largely pristine. We saw very few stumps in there. And it's 170 hectares, which is roughly the size if you took Sunnybrook Park and Glendon and Wilkett and all of those parks. That's about how big this area is, of pristine 400-year-old forest that's unprotected in Algonquin. Another area in Algonquin, this is Herdman Creek, and these are yellow birch trees. And you guys might not even recognize them as yellow birch, right? Because you used that golden smooth bark. As they become old, they get these big plates in their bark. And again, you see that kind of the arc and the big branches up at the top of the tree and all those characteristics. The same area I also cored black ash, and that was 218 years old, which doesn't sound that old, but it's actually the oldest record I know of for Ontario. Mostly because most people don't core black ash. But it's also one of only, I think, a couple of black ash trees I cored in there. So there's probably older black ash in there. It's a really significant area. I worry about them with emerald ash. So the other significant thing about Herdman Creek is that, okay, so I'll give you a little context on this map. So the yellow, you can read it there, but the yellow is known logging. The kind of fuchsia and pink is the unprotected old growth. But these burgundy kind of areas, the kind of reddish purpley areas, those are roadless areas. And if you look up at the top, Herdman Creek is actually, it's kind of blocked out, but so Herdman Creek is right here. Didn't make that go away.
I think we can all be down if you want. We'll probably drag it.
How do you do it?
Yeah, from.
Just try and get all that. It's gone from there now. You know, I could live with that. Oh, there you go.
You can just move it. You can just move it out of your way to show it. Move it back.
Okay. Yeah, so there's Herdman Creek. And that's this little patch of old growth here. So, but it's also in the middle of this huge roadless area. So now I can't move it off to the side. So here's something interesting. If you add up all, oh, what's going on?
Let me pause the share.
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
Just scroll it. Kick you back. Play select.
Oh, weird. Now it went back to that.
That's weird.
Okay. Yeah. So if you add up all those roadless areas at the old growth in Algonquin, it's actually only about 5% of the park. So right now, about 35% of the park is protected, which might surprise some people. So the rest is available for logging. And it's a tough problem. Like, I don't think of it as an easy problem, right? You get the whole jobs, like it's been logged for so long. It's a tricky problem. But to me, it's not a tricky problem to protect those remaining old growth and wilderness areas. To me, that should be at least our short-term goal, you know, because that's something that to me is quite achievable. And why do wilderness areas matter? Well, it's just to give you a sense of this is what the roaded areas look like in the park, and it adds up to a lot of. There's actually a researcher named Trevor Hesselink who did a study in the Boreal, which is probably it applies some fairly well to Algonquin, and he found that 14 to 24% of the land that was being logged never regenerated because it was stuff like this. Like it's not just the road, but the landing areas around it, the smaller offshoots. There's a lot of area that does not regenerate before you go back to cut again. So, I mean, there's obvious carbon implications if your forestry is removing 14 to 24% of the forest permanently or semi-permanently. It also has a lot of habitat implications, right? It's a lot of fragmentation. So those roadless areas are important because the roads have such a huge impact. And historically, some of the areas that were logged even don't have roads in them. So even some of those areas, those large roadless areas may not be old growth because they may have been logged with horses at one time, but they don't look like this. So I think those roadless areas and those old growth areas are the obvious candidates for protection in Algonquin. Okay, so this is where we get a little bit heavy, and then I try to bring things back to hopeful because I think there is a ton of hope. Hemlock. This is Hemlock woolly adelgid. So this is the tiny insect in the room when we talk about hemlock. It has now entered officially. It's been around for a long time. It's been killing trees in the United States, hemlock trees. It's now in Ontario. It will kill quite a few of our hemlock trees. In the north, now that it's getting into the colder parts of hemlock's range, it's not killing trees as quickly. But it will kill a lot of our hemlock trees. Unfortunately, so there's some bad news. Some good news is Algonquin is so cold, even with climate change projections, we will not see hemlocks dying there for a long time, up to a century. So, which is enough time to see what happens, and things may change by then. So Algonquin is really important for conserving hemlock. It's pretty amazing. But Hemlock woolly adelgid, of course, not the only thing that's killing our trees. Like I said, it gets a little heavy. So emerald ash borer killing this ash tree on the left. The tree in the middle is a butternut being killed by butternut canker. On the right was actually the most beautiful old growth butternut I'd ever seen in Thornton Vales until it died a few years ago from butternut canker. So we're losing a lot of trees, and those are, of course, there's Dutch elm disease, and there's the chestnut, but there's more coming as well. So we've got Asian longhorn beetle on the right, which has been found a couple of times in Ontario and eradicated. It keeps showing up around North America in general and being eradicated. Fortunately, it's a worse flyer than emerald ash borer. So so far, we've managed to not have it kill, because it kills maple trees, all maple trees. So the implications of that are huge. Like 1,000 cankers disease kills walnuts, and unfortunately also butternuts. Oak wilt. 1,000 cankers is not yet in Ontario, but we can expect it probably to come across the border because it's in I believe it's in Ohio, I think. Oak wilt is now across the border from the Detroit area. It kills the red oak family, red oak, black oak. So it's a lot of bad news. There's some good news, there's some solutions as well as some good news. Mostly solutions, right? Because we're very quick. This is terrible news, right? It's heartbreaking news, and we're very quick to try to find a culprit. And often we think of climate change as the culprit. It's not. generally the culprit. It may play a role in some things like woolly adelgid, but it's actually mostly shipping, it's trade, it's global trade. And the solutions are there. Like there's actually, this is called Tree Smart Trade, and it's like these are their solutions that they're proposing, which are all doable to stop these things coming across the border. So emerald ash borer came in pallets or in boxes. They live, the larvae are in the wood, and they make a pallet out of it, and then it emerges here, and then it starts killing our trees. That's exactly what happened with emerald ash borer. That is why Asian longhorn beetle has shown up a couple of times as well, same way. So you can tighten up compliance, which has started happening and is making a big difference. You can switch to non-wood, so you could use like plywood, engineered wood. There's all kinds of ways, and then there's no chance of these things coming in. So I think you can control the nursery trade, which brings in the fungi, the pathogens. These are all things that are doable. And they've actually started working to some extent in the States. And I think Canada's not too badly positioned compared to the States. But so I got the numbers from CFA because I was like, how bad are we? Because the States has had a lot of problems and they've been correcting it slowly. So I was like, how bad is Canada? So I got the numbers from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, who actually looks after this stuff. And who got the numbers from the CBSA, who does the actual inspections. And about 10%, so 90, these are like, this is great, over 90% of shipments are compliant. Doesn't sound that great, right? But then only 0.1% of shipments are infested with live pests. Well, that sounds good, except we have millions of shipments, right? So that's a huge number. And they don't inspect most of them. If they inspected all of them, that would be fine, right? But they don't inspect the large majority of shipments. So we're bringing a lot of insight. You know, CFIA person in a talk that I saw, she said it is a leaky system. So this is what we need to be, one of the things we need to be focusing on. I'm not sure how we make this a higher priority, because it seems to only be a priority when a bunch of trees start dying. But we want to get it before the next trees start dying. And your parent organization, Ontario Nature, actually is better than most. But most, even they don't have kind of the bandwidth for this, and the NGOs aren't really picking it up. It's not an issue. I don't know if you guys have any idea how to make it a bigger issue. So it is changing, but it's not changing fast enough. But we could theoretically just stop this from happening. Like more than theoretically, it's quite possible, quite doable. This is beech bark disease. It's killing our beech trees. So there's a scale insect, the white sort of fuzz on the tree is a scale insect. It exudes a waxy coating. And then on the right, that's a fungus that then goes and kills the trees. And over time, they start to look like this. They're either dead or they have these cankers. It kills at least 80% of trees, but then another 15% or more are heavily diseased, and they never really look like beech trees anymore. But fortunately, there is resistance, and there's actually quite a bit of resistance. There's actually, by the way, a little bit of resistance in emerald ash borer. There's resistance for all of these trees, right? With beech, it's better than most. It's actually up to 5% resistance. So there's something that I find very hopeful. I go into all these forests, and it's again, it's kind of heartbreaking because you see beech trees dying. But now, if I go into forest and I see beech trees dying, I start looking, and it's not that uncommon that I will see a resistant tree. And then I mark it on iNaturalist and upload it to my project. And maybe there's actually been some expression of interest that they will eventually do genetic work with it or use those observations. So there's something you can do if you guys are out using iNaturalist and you see beech trees, start checking them. If they have all those signs, or they're dead, or they have the cankers, then you know they're clearly not resistant. But then you'll see these trees, and so on the left here, that's in Long Sault Conservation Area, and on the two on the right are actually, that's in Bronte Creek. There's some beautiful, big, resistant beech trees in Bronte Creek, and you'll see tons of fallen, like dead beech trees. But then you'll see these resistant trees, and it's, to me, if you take the long view, That's hopeful, right? You take the view beyond our human lifetime and out at these tree length lifetimes. And the real kind of the best example of that is the Elm Recovery Project. The Elm Recovery Project started going around. They got people would report to them where they found resistant beech trees, these big healthy beech trees, elm trees, sorry, these elm trees, years after the disease had gone through, Dutch elm disease, right, killed most of the elm trees from the 40s, and then again, like there's a couple of different waves. So if you see a large elm tree now, you can think it might be resistant. So they got reported to the University of Guelph Arboretum, and they went out, they started taking cuttings and growing those probably resistant elm trees, and they found that there was actually multiple different pathways of resistance between the different trees. And so what they did then is, rather than just try to release them to the public as like a single like clone, they said, well, in the long run, we're gonna need a lot of genetic diversity. We can't just release a clone. So they planted orchards of all these different, based on all these trees from around Ontario, and let them start interbreeding. And they're taking this long view, like I was talking about, where they're looking beyond the lifetimes of the researchers and saying, this is how we restore this tree in the next century. So that brings me. Another thing that brings me a lot of hope. This is the view over the Humber Valley. This is near Bolton, the Humber Valley Heritage Trail, another underrated trail. So 100 years ago, most of this wouldn't have been forested. We've tripled our forest cover since our low point in the early 1900s. So that's pretty much like since this club formed, we've tripled the forest cover. And think about that's all forest that is now, a lot of it is, some of it's young, some of it's middle-aged, some of it is becoming old growth. Here, so along that Humber Valley Heritage Trail, here's these beautiful wolf trees growing in a younger forest. So these were old pasture trees that developed this amazing character because they grew in the open for so long, and then the forest started growing around them. And they're basically old growth trees in a younger forest. They're something to watch out for on the landscape. These were obviously growing in a pasture, and they're great habitat actually for a lot of wildlife. But also along the Humber Valley there's this old growth forest. It's around 150 years old. It was logged when they built a mill just downstream from it. And now it's recovering. And it's actually quite a beautiful old growth forest. It's really starting to look and feel like an old growth forest again, 150 years later. Then consider that we've tripled our forest cover. How much more of this young developing old growth forest is going to be coming up, like showing up, in the next 50 years. And to me, that's also very hopeful. Like, we are restoring the landscape. And maybe, given time, that forest will look like this. This is Peters Woods, which is at the far east end of the Oak Ridges Moraine. And Peters Woods has trees that are 300 or 400 years old, like lots of them. It has some of the oldest white oaks, some of the oldest oaks in Ontario. And how was it preserved? It was actually, the story locally goes, because it was called McDonald Woods. And the story is the McDonald family preserved it. They didn't log it, but they even had to pay a fine to the crown for not logging it. And that's how it was preserved. Yeah, it's this amazing, it's highly recommend going there. It's small. You can walk around it in probably half an hour if you walk quick, but you could take your time and just see things there for hours probably. So think about these oak trees that are well over 400 years old. Okay, so for sure, those trees knew that were shaken by that living wind, right? For sure, passenger pigeons ate their acorns. So I wanted to jump back around to Aldo Leopold, who came up with that turn of phrase. He wrote that when he was writing. There was an unveiling of a monument to the passenger pigeon in Wisconsin, and he also said that it's tempting. It's easy for us to feel that we have no part in the extinction of the passenger pigeon, but he says our ancestors were our agents because they believed that the people's comforts, people's desires were more important than the beauty of the land or the creatures that lived there. But then this is what he said. So I think the McDonald family shared that doubt that that was true, right? They must have, or they would have logged that forest. I think probably everyone in this room shares that doubt. You know, that every whim of ours is more important than the beauty of the land or the creatures on it. But I also think if you look at what just happened with the greenbelt, that it goes far beyond this room. I think a lot of people share that doubt. Yeah. So we're not alone. Yeah, and that's the end.